you plan, and then you realize, oh my God, it just kept growing and growing and growing. So nevertheless, we will not be deterred by that, on the contrary. So I want to just very quickly, before I actually start what I call my first mini lecture, there's the next 3 hours are, there's a format, and I just want to share that format so you know what's coming, and that you understand that I'm not just going to do all the work here. It's like we're going to do this work together, because essentially that's what's required. So I'm going to do a small piece kind of interrogating the context of power and some of these issues. And then there's going to be an activity that you're going to do at your tables. And then we're going to come back, and then we're going to kind of quickly debrief that experience. Then I will come back and do the second mini lecture, which is kind of looking at what I call critical principles of leadership for social justice, and what are the central tenets and aspects of what that means. And then I'm going to have you once again go in the groups, in your small groups, and really answer several questions. And you'll have, there's 4 questions, essentially asking you to think about some of the issues that were raised, but in what ways are you already engaging these issues? In what ways are you finding obstacles to those issues? What are some very concrete ways in which you could begin to engage many of these questions in your work? But anyway, so that just gives you a sense of how the breakup is. So it's a little bit different than just sitting and listening to a keynote piece without your participation and collaboration. It's trying to bring the best of the directivity that sometimes is needed in our teaching, along with the participatory element, which is required of our teaching, and the fact that we learn in different ways. I know that you were supposed to have received the article, so hopefully you've read it, but I'm not going to count on it, nor am I going to take notes, because I know how busy faculty are, and I know how busy many of you are. I hope that you've had a chance to skim it. If you've had, I hope that that the presentation is going to only work to reinforce some of those issues that I raised in that particular piece, and that will only work to bring new questions to the table. I'm not here really to have you go away feeling that everything's in a nice little pretty package, and that it's all done, and somehow that I have all the answers. That is the furthest thing from the truth. I mean, that would be absolutely just, I'm sorry, sometimes the easiest thing is just to use a term that would just be bullshit, right? I mean, that would just be complete nonsense to think that anybody could get up. I mean, we know that people do get up and act as if they have all the answers, and that's part of the problem we're dealing with in relationship to the work we're doing, the struggles that we're about. However, the most important piece here that I hope will come out of this work is that we bring ourselves to this work. And that in that process, it isn't only about bringing ourselves to the work effectively, but it's also bringing ourselves to the work as intellectuals, as cultural workers. And it is with that spirit in which I offer the work this afternoon. So let me begin my talk. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire wrote, and this is one of my favorite quotes, and I often begin with this: the more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality, so that knowing it better, he or she can transform it. The individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. The person's not afraid to meet the people or to enter into dialogue with them. The person does not consider himself or herself the proprietor of history or of all the people or the liberator of the oppressed, but he or she does commit herself or himself within history to fight at their side. Freire sincerely believed that if we were unwilling to unveil the world, it would be impossible for us to move towards educational justice or towards a more just society. Almost 50 years after the publication of Freire's book in English, the inequalities and injustices that he was struggling to address then continue to persist in the United States and around the globe. In many instances, these conditions have actually worsened in the last 2 decades with the infusion of neoliberal policies and practices of privatization, deregulation, and the free market into education. This is significant in that Freire recognized only too well the manner in which the political economy is inextricably linked to education. It's tied to the very essence of how we teach and what we consider to be legitimate knowledge. Moreover, it has been his revolutionary critique of capitalism as a root of domination and the connection between educational inequalities and class struggle that have most been watered down, resulting in the enfeeblement of his very revolutionary ideas with respect to the question of the oppressed. Yet it is impossible to speak about leadership for social justice today without unveiling the manner in which neoliberalism has eroded emancipatory efforts within education, emancipatory efforts that were struggled for within the context of civil rights, and in many communities, finding the very issues that we struggled for 23 years ago, now simply coming right back to the same. We feel like we're back to square one in many contexts. The institutions often unfortunately bypass then complex questions tied to diversity and emancipatory struggles for social justice, and this has resulted in economic policies and practices that wittingly or unwittingly reproduce oppressive structures and relationships despite rhetorical claims to the contrary. This constitutes for me one of the biggest problems that we face, and within a context like CPED, where there is this effort to try to bring a different practice to the table, it's impossible to do that without engaging the ways we think about the world and the manner in which these continue to serve power and privilege in the society. In today's corporatized university, for example, students have become consumers of educational services rather than cultural citizens who grapple to understand themselves and their world. Knowledge has become a commodity of profit, teaching a market transaction driven by standardized instructional models and a banking pedagogy obsessed with the use of educational technology, punitive forms of assessment, data collection and accountability regimes, as well as curriculum that for the most part has become narrowly instrumentalized. In this context, then, the troubled conditions of the world are easily obscured despite growing repression of democratic rights, increasing poverty in the midst of obscene wealth accumulation, a state of perpetual war, the proliferation of police shootings of the innocent civilians, the unprecedented incarceration of people of color, and state-sanctioned attacks against public education by unaccountable billionaires, corporate foundations, and the media. Many of the past concerns about social and material inequalities and institutional responsibilities have been effectively overridden by an unrelenting culture of racism, rampant greed, wholesale surveillance, and the social containment of subaltern populations. With this in mind, Wendy Brown asserts that the American nightmare today constitutes an indefensible alliance of neoliberalism, conservatism, and the undoing of democratic life. She rightly argues that neoliberalism and neoconservatism are two distinct and contrary political rationalities that converge in their devaluation of political liberty, equality, substantive citizenship, and the rule of law, in favor of market-driven governance and institutional policies on one hand, and valorization of state power for moralistic gains on the other. The convergence results in undemocratic institutional forms that, despite social justice or diversity claims, are indifferent to the veracity and accountability and to political freedom and equality, defying even liberal ideals of the academy. So much so that Brown warns neoliberal reason is converting the distinctly political character, meaning, and operation of democracy's constituent elements into economic ones. Liberal democratic institutions, practices and habits may not survive this conversion. Radical democratic dreams may not either. And this becomes an important one as we sit around and we think about what do we have to do different? How do we create a different future? How do we together look for a different destiny, a destiny that in fact creates a place for all to be a part? Consequently, the transformative notions of multiculturalism and diversity within education anchored upon community concerns have been derailed by an economic ethos that renders one difference or for the utilitarian pursuits of the affluent. Instead of diversity being something that really moves towards changing the conditions within communities, often what ends up happening is it only serves to perpetuate the interests of those in power. Accordingly, scholarship, leadership, and activism for structural change, political inclusion, economic access, and human rights have given way to multicultural market niches, the management of an international workforce, a colonizing paradigm of international education, and the racializing portrayal of happy colored faces on pamphlets and websites. Yet in this efficient and cost-effective neoliberal world, where difference is celebrated, those considered to be deficient and unable to assimilate to the homogeneity of educational culture are too often pushed to the margins of society, left abandoned, divested, impoverished, criminalized, and put behind iron bars and with little concern for their numbers or for their well-being. Furthermore, there is a blatant and commonsensical disregard for those unable to keep in step with the dehumanizing accountability culture that neoliberalism promotes, which is sadly as much at work today within the culture of education as it is out in the corporate world. Accordingly, universities have become overwhelmingly driven by an economic rationalism where the financial bottom line capsizes any full-fledged notion of social justice, of democratic participation, or community life. So it's not just to be involved in the community in terms of businesses. It's not just, what we have to think about is what are the consequences of those community involvements? Because often the people who are allowed to participate are the people who are willing to go along with the program that in fact has not helped the majority. And we've got to be willing to ask those questions. Otherwise, what we do is we pat ourselves in the back, but often we produce the very conditions that continue the oppression, that continue the inequalities. Genuine democratic life within schools and society, which must be at the core of any form of leadership for social justice, cannot be practiced if the impact of economic Darwinism is left unchallenged. Henry Giroux speaks of economic Darwinism drawn from the notion of social Darwinism to illustrate the manner in which neoliberal policies within education have functioned overtly and covertly to support the survival of the fittest. More specifically, he points to policies of deregulation, privatization, and lack of concern for the public good, rendering both democratic education and social welfare of the nation an endangered species. Giroux further implicates the logic of neoliberalism with its value of unchecked competition, unbridled individualism, and a demoralizing notion of individual responsibility as major culprits in the legitimation crisis and ethical impoverishment of neoliberal educational leaders who ascribe to the profit logic that systematically undermines culturally democratic life. The disabling economic logic entrenched across education is particularly evident within graduate school education, where future academics and developing public intellectuals are initiated into a career as social capital orientation that thwarts the necessary critical engagement for the construction of transformative knowledge, knowledge with the potential to challenge advancing inequalities orchestrated by the wealthy and the powerful. Structures of accountability have also become more intense in the last decade as colleges and universities have instituted expectations that their professors from all different disciplines become effective grant writers and fundraisers in their quest for the security of tenure and employment. Hence, a great deal of the energies of our graduate students and young professors in major public universities and even in state universities today is being directed away from emancipatory efforts and community commitments and instead towards becoming published within referee journals, getting publicly noticed as some rising star on the conference circuit, and developing effective grant writing skills while competitively shaping their research agendas to garner private and public funds. The struggle for us is that, in order to do the work, you need money. The catch-22 is often that the folks who hold on to the money have particular requirements. And so we're in a situation to have to think through in education, how do we align ourselves with respect to those requirements? And what are the consequences when we can't align ourselves politically? Because the consequences are devastating. Although none of this is entirely new to academia, The disappearance of tenure-track positions and the increase in adjunct or part-time employment in the last several decades, along with brutal competition among new doctoral graduates for tenure-track employment, has proven especially treacherous for those graduates saddled with huge debt. Moreover, with an exaggerated emphasis placed on STEM, this has made graduates in the humanities and social sciences particularly vulnerable to current neoliberal priorities within higher education. However, it's worth noting that STEM tenured faculty positions are not easily attained either, and over 50% of all jobs in STEM do not even require a bachelor's degree. In concert with dwindling then academic posts, young graduate students hoping to become tenured faculty or university administrators are counseled to abandon their idealism or their idealistic intentions and to position themselves competitively for a job in ways that will, on one hand, gain them recognition as somehow innovative thinkers, while on the other, make them good institutional fit. This generally points to possessing certain traits, right, like academic pedigree, entrepreneurial predisposition, core values of individualism and competition, a naive, centrist or conservative political orientation, a subdued social justice outlook, and a conduciveness to hierarchical leadership. Anyone who doesn't fall in that is going to struggle. If you're struggling, this is part of the reason. Unfortunately, good institutional fit is too often linked to the manner in which classism and racism, patriarchy, disableism, homophobia, and other inequalities coalesce to preserve institutional conditions of power and privilege within the university. Drawing on Peggy McIntosh's work on white privilege, we can point to university conditions of power and privilege that are reflected in the daily practices of higher education, for example. Conditions of privilege that betray promises of diversity or social justice despite best examples. And I'm just going to kind of go quickly through just a couple of things. For example, if you're a person, I can critique my institution and talk about how much I dislike its policies and behaviors without being seen as a cultural outsider. If you're considered to be a part of the dominant culture, this is what you're going to experience. I can feel that I'm an authority on social justice even if I've never lived in poverty or experienced racism nor studied scholarly literature in the field. Suddenly the issue of racism becomes more about opinion than it is about scholarly work and lived knowledge. I look for grants and research that provide me the most acclaim or funding rather than those tied to emancipatory objectives, because there's not much prestige in that. My experience in the field of study is rarely questioned or criticized, in fact, its value, and often gains me entrance into committees and task forces because I'm the diversity person. I'm not one of the few or only cultural mirrors for my students from cultural communities at universities, so I can be certain that they will find other colleagues who can share a similar viewpoint. And this is the issue of workload. So if we're going to talk about shifting education, we've got to look at the ways in which the absence, you bring more students of color into the context, right? But if you've not really cultivated professors of color to be and to stay within programs, to work with these students, then what actually ends up happening is that those who do stay, we end up working our asses off. That's all I can tell you. I mean, and you do because partly you've gone into this work not as a career, you've gone into this work as a political commitment, as a commitment for transformation. And so the consequence is that then you're saddled often with workload that people don't want to take. Not to mention that often people don't see the brilliance in our students, particularly students of color who come from working class communities. They don't know how to read the brilliance of their intellect and their historical knowledge, their own lived knowledge, and as a consequence are too ready to write them off. These are some of the issues that we've got to be willing to contend with. In slide 17, I just move on. You can't even read these, I know. But you get the gist of what I'm saying. So you've got the paper. Let's just go through them. So you can see that there's a whole multitude of these, right? I can be sure that if I talk to the dean, program director, chair of the department, I will most often be facing a person that looks like me. That is, I am called into the office for one of my actions. I can be sure I haven't been signaled out because of my race. I can go home from most meetings feeling somewhat tied in rather than isolated, out of place, outnumbered, outheard, and distanced or feared because I spoke up about a problem. I mean, these are very real issues. We say we're about social justice. These are the ways in which injustices manifest themselves within the context in which we work. Unmasking then, or unveiling power and privilege must then be understood as a central concern of leadership for social justice in education, in that all aspects of our work are shaped by lived ideologies of power, for it is when we grapple directly with the micro and the macro. It is not just microaggressions. The micro and the macro aggressions, or the personal and collective consequences of asymmetrical power relations in concrete ways, that we most experience resistance and backlash within personal and institutional relationships. Often this backlash can be expressed as defensive responses to free-flowing and guilt associated with being white. And I have to, the hard thing that I have when I'm speaking about this stuff is that sometimes people expect me to be kind of dispassionate. That somehow I can't be, and I'm not going to apologize for it. I cannot be dispassionate, and I cannot distance myself, because it is part of my history, and it's part of my lived experience, and it has been part of my work for over 40 years. As such, there are those who believe that guilt, for example, is the glue that holds racism together. But I want to complicate this notion by arguing that racism is but one of the most destructive means by which capitalist society perpetuates structural forms of social and material oppression, which impact the physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual well-being of subaltern populations. This view is founded on the recognition that what holds racism and patriarchy and homophobia and a myriad of other destructive ideologies and unjust practices in place is their very effective social and political function in perpetuating unmerciful political economy, which on one hand keeps the majority of people existing in poverty, and on the other hand teaches them to blame themselves for their impoverishment. An economy of greed is what drove slavery, and it is an economy of greed that continues to drive racism and impoverishment today, not the other way around. If the inequality was primarily only about racism, then we would not have to contend with the fact that, according to the most recent census, most poor people in the United States are white. We're talking about 18.9 million people, with more white people receiving some sort of public assistance in this country than all people of color put together. This is not to say that racism isn't real and it isn't central to this work, but rather to ask ourselves, why is it that whenever representations of poverty appear in the media or printed news, these overwhelmingly depict Black impoverished subjects? In what ways do racializing depictions condition people to ignore or obfuscate the realities of class struggle, struggles that move across oppressed communities, across oppressed populations, to perpetuate a political economy where less than 20% of the population controls over 93% of the wealth, leaving 7% of the wealth to be distributed among 80% of the rest of the population. I always bring these statistics up because we talk about social justice, but somehow the economic question is simply left off the table. And it becomes an issue that, whether white people like Black people. It is so much more intense than that. The work is so much more, complex than that. It has to do with the manner in which we must engage the realities of the society in which we live. More importantly, we must acknowledge that despite the best efforts of the war on poverty, civil rights struggles, and the best intentions of philanthropic organizations over the last 50 years, income inequality has actually increased rather than decreased. Hence, we must acknowledge and contend with the fact that commonsensical ideologies of inequality are intimately linked to perpetuating poverty, not as an aberration, but a necessity of the political economy. All this said, we must come to accept that simply understanding the problem or expressing regret for the dire consequences of injustice that persists in this country and around the world are only the very first step of social justice work. The transformation of injustice must be accomplished with real concrete practices that can reconfigure the structures of power and wealth. Yet, practices devoid of theory cannot sustain the transformation of material conditions as a new way of life without the evolution of an emancipatory consciousness that gives primacy to not only our humanity but to all forms of life on the planet. We will be unable to change the course of history. And if you're not about changing the course of history, then we cannot be talking about leadership for social justice. In order to forge practices that reclaim, reframe, and redesign pedagogy, research, and leadership for social justice requires a deep epistemological and ontological transformation that decolonizes the deeply sedimented formulation of inequalities that persist in the individualistic psyche of the U.S. society. To move, moreover, towards humanizing and just educational practices, we must work tirelessly to abandon ideologies of patriarchy, of racism, of homophobia, disableism, and other forms of oppression, which function to sustain unmerciful interests of capitalist greed that perpetuate ruling class structures of supremacy. And it is impossible to move towards ways of thinking and being that truly support a more just world without the full participation of those who most suffer the indignities and abominations of a political economic system that requires their impoverishment despite the empty platitudes and promises that have been dispensed in the past. The people who understand most about oppression are the people who are living it. The people who understand most about poverty are the people that are living it. Unfortunately, however, the way we structure what knowledge is valuable, we seldom speak the people who have most to tell us about the problems that they're dealing and suffering with. The work for social justice then requires both personal and collective commitment and participation. On the personal level, it requires that we become more conscious of the ways in which commonsensical notions related to power in this society persist, through the ideological formations that shape our own decision-making every single day. Moreover, specific manifestations of oppression tend to be engaged in isolated phenomena, rather than part of a larger social, political, economic phenomena where all oppression is understood as interconnected. Similarly, our perceptions and responses to configurations of power are significant to how we define, how we understand, how we apply, and conceptualize social justice work. Hence, it is impossible to engage in a practice of critical principles of leadership if we are unable to recognize that all forms of oppression are interconnected and existing simultaneously. Okay, I'm going to give you a break. From here, what I hope is clear, what I'm trying to say is that the context is absolutely crucial to how we think about education for social justice, and therefore how we teach and how we think about leadership for social justice. Principal to this is a manner in which each of us are inculcated with respect to how we look at the question of power, how we define it, how we think about the very structures of power, what we legitimate with our consensus about power. And often we do this completely without thinking, in that they become commonsensical notions. They become ways of living, ways of being that actually were socialized since we were young children. And generally they were socialized very deeply within our schooling. So what I want to do is I want to kind of give you, kind of stop for a minute, and I want within your groups, there's a small story. There's a small activity called the Drawbridge. Some of you may know this activity, then you're ahead of the game. But this activity is simply a little story in a totally other land, right? Kind of a fairy tale, whatever. But anyway, it's Lillian Katz used this particular story, and she found it to be very useful, and I found it to be very useful as well. And so I want to just go through this story, and it's on your tables. And then I'm going to ask each table to just do a ranking of who you consider to be most responsible and least responsible for the Baroness death. So I'll just read this this little story. And it'll give you a shift. You have to be able to shift with me, because shifting is part of our ability to learn, and it's our ability to move in different ways to understand the world. So in this activity, here's the story. As he left for his visit to the outlying districts, the jealous Baron warned his pretty wife, "Do not leave the castle while I am gone, or I will punish you severely when I return." But as the hours passed, the young Baroness grew lonely, and despite her husband's warning, decided to visit her lover, who lived in the countryside nearby. The castle was located on an island in a wide, free-flowing river with a drawbridge linking the island and the land at its narrowest point in the river. "Surely my husband will not return before dawn," she thought, and ordered her servants to lower the drawbridge and leave it down until she returned. After spending several pleasant hours with her lover, the Baroness returned to the drawbridge only to find it blocked by a madman wildly waving a long and extremely sharp knife. "Do not attempt to cross the bridge," he said, "or I will kill you," he raved. Fearing for her life, the Baroness returned to the lover and asked for help. "Our relationship is only a romantic one," he said. "I will not help." The Baroness then sought out a boatman on the river, explained her plight to him, and asked him to take her across the river in his boat. "I will do it, but only if you can pay my fee of 5 marks. "But I have no money with me," the Baroness protested. "That is too bad. No money, no ride," the boatman said flatly. Her fear growing, the Baroness ran crying to the home of a friend, and again, explaining the situation, begged for enough money to pay the boatman his fee. "If you had not disobeyed your husband, this would not have happened," the friend said. "I will give you no money." With dawn approaching and her last resources exhausted, the Baroness returned to the bridge in desperation, attempted to cross the castle, and was slain by the madman. So your task, your mission, if you should wish to accept it, which of course dates me completely, right? Is in your small group, just very quickly. The problem with academics is that we get really into our head. So we get really, we just start picking it apart completely. You only have 20 minutes, and in 20 minutes, your table has to rank from who's the most responsible for the Baroness' death to who's not, and just a few reasons why your group decided to rank it in that way. And when we come back, I'm just going to ask for volunteers to share with us what went on in your groups. 20 minutes. And when you're done, there's papers across. Put your ranking down on the papers on the wall. We're just going to take a few minutes actually, about 15 minutes, to try to kind of debrief some of the major issues or major, it could be questions, it could be, the difficulties. Really believe it or not, the ranking is just a process. Really the important piece of this whole thing, in case you feel like I asked the wrong question, or just so that you know that that's not the issue. The issue really is whatever happens in your groups as you were trying to have these conversations, right? That's the real issue. The second thing I want you to know is that I use this in my course on ethics, and it is, it always brings about very, very interesting conversations, right, about the issue of power and how people relate to power. So I'm going to step down here, and Deborah is supposed to be there. So who wants to share? Just, whoever's willing to share, we can start with you. And then I'll just, we'll do some responding back and forth and just try to get a feel of what some of the issues that people face as they were trying to engage in this activity.
We'll all be very quick so that other people can share, but there's a main core of what we did. And the person who couldn't decide would say, and then we got the idea, well, they have their values, maybe it's okay to have lover there, and we have our values, and finally I just said, I'm going to tell you what, I know he's an oppressor because he threatened horrible punishment. And I know that those who are oppressed are always blamed, so she's not going to get blamed, period. And I just put her at the bottom, and she was going up and down all through it. And then I kind of lost interest, and they said, hey, we put your order up. So I think I dominated, and it's not their fault.
So then we could have a conversation of how you got to dominate. But that's for another time, right? Next year.
We debated, we were 3 against 2, male, female. But that was an issue, yeah. And she was trying to dominate, so. We decided that it was either Donald, Bernie, or Hillary. And then we wound up with the Baroness, because she had a lot of different options that she could have chosen.
So you all, in comparison to your colleague here, you all have decided that the Baroness is the most responsible.
Yes.
Okay, so there's dissent. There's dissent. Can I just, very quickly, why was the Baroness responsible?
She had a lot more options than anyone else did. She chose her course of action more than anyone.
Okay, so you get very quickly to dissent. This is the dissenting.
So the dissenting side, and then I backed down because I was dominating, then I realized I was dominating the group, which was probably not very socially good of myself. But I said it was the Baron because I felt that he was oppressing her, and the oppressed don't always have the options, that they don't see the options that we think they have, so she may not have seen any other option.
So
how could you have dominated the group if you didn't win?
I did try, and they all sparked it, and then I thought, I tended to get in trouble a lot in my career of dominating.
So our group had a wonderful conversation, and we recognized there's probably no right answers. But what I think we were all in agreement with was that the Baron created the culture within which all of this happened. And so we put him as the first person. But even though I first brought up, well, the madman killed her, so isn't he the most responsible? But we came to the point that it was the culture that somehow made it okay for the madman to be out there waiting to kill her. And then we put the Baroness as third, and we felt the boatman was the least, even though we can go, well, you could see him as the economic system representing that, because without money, she wasn't allowed to cross, but we still put him as the least culpable, or she as the least culpable, whichever the boat person is. And then the Baroness third, and the friend and the lover, it was really hard to decide. I mean, though the friend, you would expect more from a friend than you would from a lover. Sorry.
I don't want to put you off, but I think that as you keep listening, what you're hearing are some of the ways in which people make sense of the world. And I hope that you're hearing it. All right, who else?
Johnny.
Oh, thank you. Okay, one over here and then we'll come over here, since we have two guys left.
Our group felt victimized. And as a result, we chose not to do the exercise. We found our sense of agency and basically said the hell with it.
All right, so you all clap, and I want to say that what that expresses is real privilege. You have the privilege to essentially say, go to hell, I'm not going to do it. that expresses that people feel quite privileged in order to do that. You don't have,
don't have flowers.
and we don't have, so they're really pissed off. But anyway, but I think this is important because as leaders, that you have just been put into a situation that in fact often people are in situations where they have
That's how you dominate.
right. Now mind you, that doesn't necessarily change a damn thing. Okay. So part of our struggle is, we can laugh and we can joke and we can see, we can engage these questions and we can see how people engage their privilege and feel comfortable enough, to push back. However, all of those pieces help us to understand that we're positioned in very different ways and located socially in different ways, depending on our cultures, our class, our gender, our abilities, our religion. I mean, there's a whole set of pieces. And often we're in the worst dilemmas when we have to make decisions. So you right now, you decided, oh, this wasn't important enough. Which, if you think about it, I asked you to do something, right? Just like people asked me to do something, and you made a decision to essentially say, we're not going to play your game, and then think about, like the reasons for why that was a choice. Because they're meaningful, and we have to see them as meaningful in our life.
But resistance doesn't always equal privilege, right? What if I'm the kid in the classroom who's resisting a school system that has never benefited me, and then I'm actually at a disadvantage for my resistance, which is still resistance, exactly what they did.
Resistance, and every action and decision that is made has to be linked to how people are located socially. It doesn't have the same meaning. We want to believe, and this is part of very Eurocentric thinking, a notion that somehow there is only one way to be human, there's only one way to make decisions, there's only one way to solve the problems. The fact is that we need a multitude of ways to solve problems. We need a multitude of readings of those problems. Otherwise, what happens is that we end up misreading. And often we misread because we don't have a real conversation, right? We don't really listen to why people are resisting. We don't look at the context in which they're resisting. And we don't look at the consequences. So all of those elements are significant in terms of thinking of a theory of resistance.
So why are they resisting? Is that relevant?
They would be there, if you wanted to really understand, like let's say this is a group, right? And you want to understand why they're resisting. The only way that we could really get to it is we would have to sit and we'd have to really listen why people participated in this form of resistance and what it meant to them. To try to do it in any other way is essentially, you can either say it doesn't have any meaning, which I'm not willing to do, or you can say the only way I can understand the meaning of that resistance is by engaging people, and through engaging people, it's a humanizing process where you recognize that they have a right to assert their social agency. It's tricky. It's tricky. What I want you to, nothing is going to feel easy today. Nothing is going to feel simple today. I don't want it to. I don't want you walking out of here thinking like, okay, we got it packed. This is complex. And the ways in which we engage these complexities are as we begin to look at the actual conditions and reasons and meanings that are behind the decisions that we make.
Just to clarify, we refused to come to consensus. We refused to come to agreement.
Right. So that
we had each engaged in the task, but we refused to come to a single agreement.
And I asked you to work as a group, right?
Yeah, okay, so we came to consensus in a little bit of asking how maybe a logic of domination and ideological structures of capitalism and patriarchy framed this in. So we kind of thought at first, well, what about, obviously in patriarchy and capitalism, the baron is, responsible in many ways of in enacting these practices of patriarchy. And we thought, in what ways does that patronize the baroness? and also particularly look at madness from a very Eurocentric and institutionalized model of what sanity is, often historically connected with femininity there too. So we put the madmen and the baroness in the center here, not to victimize them, but to say that there is sort of a way that their relationship came into play in this ideologically. And then similarly to the other group, lover and friend came here as though it's not out of its relationship to capitalism, but it wasn't monetized in the same way. And reciprocity came up from this is most of my brilliant table people too. I'm just in a communicative place here. And then we thought the boatman, I thought he was just gangster, right? He's like, no money, no move. Like, this is it. There's not necessarily an ethics around it. The dollar is the ethical bottom line, which also was not separate from patriarchal power and privilege there. But also then rose the point that the Baroness had probably left before. Not that this is to make her evil, but to say she might have had money before that was controlled by the Baron, so the capitalism and patriarchy came back into play. We really wanted to try and resist the value hierarchizing of this, or really reducing it to numbers, right? Because it's more entangled and complicated than numbers can sometimes hide the nuances of these relationships. So we thought it was, at first we were like, oh, one of these, but we loved it, so thank you.
Right here, please.
It's okay. We took a similarly ecological sort of perspective here, where we had the Baroness in the middle, but we didn't want to quite make her the complete victim. So we have dotted lines, as you see, that there are all these factors that are contributing, although we did agree that the Baron did set up those initial conditions, or culture, as some people put it. And so, yes, so all of these are contributing to her oppression, but there is some agency that she has, so there's some sort of back and forth between the social methods. That's how we make sense of it.
We can take one more and then.
So one of the very wise people in our group made, I think, an excellent point. It hasn't emerged yet. The only person that is absolutely culpable is the madman himself. And we can come up with all sorts of other reasons. She shouldn't have. He was crazy. That was that. That was that. But ultimately, who took the knife? Who did it? It was him. And that's the only thing we can actually point to. So I thought that was an excellent point to add to the conversation.
Yes. Go ahead.
In response to that point, it invites the wondering about what series of life events happened in the world of the madman to bring him to that point. So what happened within his body, in his health, in his set of experiences. So to view this person with compassion, although he is ultimately the one who killed the protagonist in the story, we don't know what series of circumstances led to his change.
All right, you know, all of the different issues, I mean, the hardest thing is to do this with professors, right? Because, you know, because we come from a culture where everybody wants to feel like they're the smartest person in the room. Everybody wants to, like, you know, like, one-up everybody. I mean, that's the culture of academia. You know it is. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The hardest thing is for us to kind of sit back and think, like, okay, what are these different ways of seeing and thinking? What do they have to tell us? And how do they entrap us into conditions and situations that in fact do little to change the world? Like, for example, we might say that, you know, the person most responsible was the person who, you know, swung the sword. However, what we lose there is a recognition that that person as an individual doesn't exist alone. And that what happens is that part of a Eurocentric, or in a Eurocentric context, the individual has primacy. That's not something I made up. I mean, the U.S., by the way, has one of the most individualistic cultures of the world. In its individualism, it fails to understand that it's a culture. So everybody's the individual, right? So suddenly the whole notion of being individual sounds kind of strange. But anyway, the issue then is that if you're just looking for who pulled the trigger, and you don't engage all of the conditions around the society and the context in which something occurs, what you do is you do not have justice. What you do is express or articulate a kind of moralistic notion that makes the individual primacy and pretends that the individual somehow functions outside of a larger social system, outside of a political, economic reality that has shaped the way he or she is. And I think that what's very hard is that we live in a society where we're taught to believe that our success is our own. We believe that somehow we made it because we were so damn smart and we knew how to get over, etc., etc. All of those elements actually work against our capacity to engage with compassion as leaders for social justice. And part of it is because we leave out a ton of factors that are absolutely significant to whether people are able to so-called succeed or not in the world. How did I become a professor? People think, oh, you must have been so, all of the nice things they want to say. You know what I say to them? I was an accident of history because I was born right at the time that when I came out of school, the whole multicultural agenda was happening. If I had come out of school now, I would have a hell of a time finding a job with the political project that I've taken on in my life. That's the reality. So before we start judging who can do and who cannot do, what we need to begin is to have a greater vision, a larger vision of history, of politics, of ideology. And that's what I want to talk to you in terms of this last piece. So let me get to that. It's a totally projective exercise, right? And the Baron, in her mind, represented the dominant class, the ruling class, the ruling society. The Baroness symbolized the oppressed population, subaltern populations. The Madman, which is actually the gateman in other stories in this exercise, is considered to be the police force or the military force who are supposed to enforce the rules. That's their whole reason for existing, is to enforce the rules. The boatman signifies the institutions. You get your service for cost. If you get with the program, you get the service, right? The neighbor is supposed to be or signifies the liberal ideals, those good intentions, but they still follow the rules, irrespective of the good intentions, right? And then the lover is, or symbolizes the enticement, such as social justice rhetoric, that's done without practice. You know, people who like to talk about equality and democracy but may not necessarily like the way it looks if you actually practice it. All right, so we're going to do the second part of this. And I know you. I wish I could be with you. If I had my way, I wish I could have you like for 3 days. No, I'm serious. That I could be with you for 3 days and just really engage. Because that last exercise, you can imagine, I could just go to town, and I could have done 2 hours on just that. And actually, it's a wonderful way to get folks to talk about issues that have to do with this question of self-determination, with how power is positioned, how different people are positioned differently in relationship to the power they hold, in terms of how people see certain people as having resources, but resources don't necessarily give them certain opportunities, even though supposedly they have those opportunities, because the structural nature of how they're positioned do not allow them to partake of those opportunities. So there's so much to be spoken. And then the last piece I want to say is that often people want to, it's not unusual for people to want to say, oh, well, they're all responsible. They're just, everybody's responsible. Everybody's responsible. But if everybody's responsible, then nobody's responsible. And the issue of responsibility, is so significant with respect to thinking of leadership. Where is responsibility? Who is responsible? That everybody might share elements of responsibility is one thing. but that certain people have more responsibility because they have more power and they have the resources to perpetuate certain practices and certain conditions cannot be overlooked. So we need to be very, very careful when we start to tread into that kind of relativism that there's, everybody has power and nobody has power, because it just really is not what we see happening in society. All right, so I want to turn now to this notion of critical praxis of leadership. And so it's a mini lecture. I'm going to do that, and then we're going to go into dialogue about it. So the dehumanizing the impact of social and material inequalities perpetuated by hierarchical and undemocratic forms of educational leadership impels us to unveil the hidden curriculum with its anti-dialogical values and practices in an effort to move towards a decolonizing vision of leadership. In so doing, our task then is to counter traditional social arrangements of accountability and institutional priorities that thwart social justice aims as we work to create a critical praxis of leadership to support self-determination and culturally democratic life. So these have to work together. This begins with a willingness to disrupt epistemologies that exclusively privilege Western assumptions that are attached to class, racialized, patriarchal, and heterosexist codes of conduct that result in what Boaventura de Santos, Sousa Santos calls an abyssal divide, where the other is rendered irrelevant or non-existent. This constitutes one of the most difficult challenges that critical leaders for social justice face when trying to establish alliances across dominant, subordinate cultural divides. Yet what is clear for those who have remained in this retracted emancipatory struggle is this: if there is to be genuinely emancipatory approaches to educational leadership, it demands a decolonizing approach that supports both individual and community empowerment. This signals an emancipatory vision also that embraces the indigenous call of idle no more. In other words, we cannot be idle no more. And extends beyond the university, where the insights and participation of administrators, faculty, students, and community members from historically oppressed communities are central to leadership for social justice in education. Inherent to such an emancipatory vision is a set of principles and ethical commitments that must inform the foundations for educational leadership. These critical principles of leadership then are shaped by critical assumptions grounded in cultural politics, political economy, the historicity of knowledge, a dialectical view of knowledge, ideology, hegemony, critique, resistance, counter-hegemony, the alliance of theory and practice, the pedagogical primacy of dialogue, and the evolution of consciousness. As such, critical principles of leadership can be understood in the following manner. I see people fanning, and you know what? I'm standing up here wanting to fan. Is there anything we can do to cool off this room? This room is so hot. Okay, thank you. All right. It's hot. In a bunch of different ways, right? All right, the first is critical leadership is pedagogical. So instead of, when we think about leaders, seldom do we think of it as a pedagogical process. So this notion motivates us away from the hierarchical and individualistic banking model of leadership to one that embraces leadership as a social phenomenon that must exist communally and evolves pedagogically through open structures of participation. The vision here is to learn together as a way of life, in which we transform the world as community through a humanizing praxis of inquiry and decision-making, where the common good stretches across our differences. This praxis embodies a central tenet of Freire's philosophy, in that he believed that apart from inquiry, apart from praxis, individuals cannot be truly human. Knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, important inquiry human beings pursue in the world and the world with each other. So human beings are always involved in inquiry. The fact that you have a formal education doesn't somehow privilege you to be the only ones that somehow are involved in thinking deeply about the world. Mechanics, you talk to a mechanic, and they will talk to you about the world using metaphors, but they're They too are intellectuals. My mother was worked in a garment district. She was a sweatshop in the sweatshop. That's what I watched her come, and I saw the impact of that. But I also saw her make sense of the world through the metaphors that were related to what she knew and what she lived. And often they were profound. So if to be human then is grounded upon our yearning to know and inquire about our world, then our leadership too must be grounded on this pedagogical imperative. It is to embody a humanizing and emancipatory vision. The next piece is that critical leadership has to be understood as a moral commitment. In Pedagogy of Freedom, Freire asserted that and this is a leadership for social justice. There's no way to do that without a moral commitment. So Freire asserted that human existence is in fact a radical and profound tension between good and evil, between dignity and indignity, between decency and indecency, between the beauty and the ugliness of the world. Yet it often has been an unwillingness to contend with institutional tensions and difficult moral questions within educational institutions and the larger society that has resulted in an oppressive bureaucracy and a paradigm of leadership that is ruled by absolute top-down and expedient policies, policies that only ignore legacies of human suffering and material oppression, but not only ignore those legacies, but also reproduce conditions that perpetuate asymmetrical relations of power. The problem that we're struggling with is that we live within one of the major values of capitalism is expediency. Expediency. So constantly we're forced to make decisions very expediently. All sorts of justifications and rationale are created for those expediencies. But often what happens then, if you have to make decisions very expediently, the people who get to make the decision are the people who have been making the decisions all along, because they have far more experiences institutionally to make those decisions. So something has got to change in how we approach decision making. Inherent to a critical theory of leadership for social justice, is understanding that if education is political, then critical leadership is a political act. As such, it is informed by a question-posing approach to leadership, which recognizes that culture and power are inextricably linked to any system of organization. That said, there must be consistent and humanizing protocols for examining in an ongoing and organic manner the consequences of decisions that are made and their impact upon the most disenfranchised. Through such a process of critical leadership for social justice, then must create the conditions to question why. A critical leadership for social justice then is never a neutral affair. There's nothing neutral about this work. As such, the vision of leadership exposes illusions of neutrality in the face of oppressive policies and practices. In its place, a dialogical process of leadership opens the way for honest questioning, for open expression of voice, for multiple forms of participation, and genuine structures of democratic decision-making, guided by a moral imperative that is linked to the consequences of policy decisions and practices, particularly upon the most vulnerable. Thus, the purpose of critical leadership, first and foremost, has to encompass an uncompromising commitment to the empowerment and self-determination of the most disenfranchised, the collective transformation of relationships, institutional structures, and material conditions in the interest of democratic life and planetary survival and evolution, and an ethos of educational practice that nurtures and cultivates our freedom to be. Critical leadership as a dialectical process then reminds us that there is always dialectical tensions between the needs of individuals and those of communities, institutions, and organizations. It is this tension that permits the individual participation in the evolution of a collective process of self-determination without degenerating into moral relativism and instead being informed by a humanizing moral compass guided by love for self, for others, and the world. It is this dialectical tension that can also help thwart forms of injustice driven by apolitical and ahistorical readings of the world that only serve the few. In this vision of leadership, critical dialogue then is a political means for empowerment and establishing participatory community. This entails purposeful communication that leads to self-determination and political action, a collective process of conscientization, communal labor that supports the development of solidarity. We build the greatest solidarity when we work together. An open and humanizing process of inquiry, as would be expected in the Freudian principle of conscientization or Conscientisation, defines the ongoing aim and practice of critical leadership for social justice. This requires us to remain ever vigilant in our continuing evolution as cultural workers as we seek to practice and develop together a greater sense of critical social consciousness. This points to personal consciousness of one's individual conditions and social location, our social consciousness about structural conditions, understanding how these two intersect, our awareness of power relations that inform cultural, political, social, and economic conditions, and to embrace individual and social responsibility as cultural citizens and subjects of history. However, none of this is possible without an ongoing process of critical democratic negotiation. We are always in negotiation. Human beings will always be negotiating issues of power. When we try to make that not happen, we are more apt to move into very fascistic ways of dealing with the world. In a critical democratic negotiation, then, the dialectical tension between authority and freedom are engaged organically within the actual context where these tensions arise. The dialectical tensions between authority and freedom is simply a part of the human condition. About this, Freire insists, it is not possible to have authority without freedom or vice versa. Here we must be willing to practice a critical form of leadership that demands our full presence beyond vulgar competition, infantilizing micromanagement, egotistical ambitions, and careerist pursuits of institutional recognition. Our work has to mean more than that. Such a leadership for social justice calls for personal vigilance and political groundedness within the context of organizational life. These critical qualities assist us to read the world more accurately, particularly with respect to the ideological intersections at work in all organizational structures. We can think of this theoretically as an axis relationship where there is an intersection between the continuum of tyranny and powerlessness on one hand, and the continuum of absolute authority and absolute freedom on the other. This is important to the struggle for social justice precisely because people in our organization will exhibit different response patterns across these continuums depending on their political coherence, their grounded experience, their cultural worldview, and the depth of their personal and communal commitment to social justice. So we need to listen very clearly. We need to engage people in very grounded ways. We need to do this in our teaching, and we need to do this with our colleagues. The problem that we're dealing with is that often the institutions in which we're working are not designed for those kind of relationships. They're designed for expedient relationships. They're designed for relationships that do not have a great deal of space for dialogue. In concert then with Freire's philosophy, engaging the cultural context in which we work is essential to our efforts, so that often the hegemony of a dominant worldview functions systematically to marginalize other ways of being. This phenomenon is what prompted Freire then to argue, one cannot expect positive results from an educational or political action program that fails to respect the particular view of the people. Such a program constitutes cultural invasion, good intentions notwithstanding. And this issue of intentions is huge, because sometimes people think that just because they have good intentions or they're good people is the argument that comes up. That somehow that when we're trying to expose the racism, the patriarchy, the ways in which homophobia continues to be active at work, and believe it, even with all the talk of transgender and all of this stuff, there's all sorts of ways in which it persists in this society. And yet there's a way in which we kind of think that our good intentions are enough. Good intentions are not enough. It's why we need practices, why we need action, and why we need a practice that is grounded theoretically and philosophically on an emancipatory vision. Another significant dimension of a critical theory of leadership is a commitment to relationships of solidarity that nurture, through the integration of our human faculties, the evolution of our political grace. Political grace is that collective force generated by those who, committed together to struggle for democratic life, seek to connect through communal relationships of struggle. Moreover, given its emancipatory purpose, a critical praxis of leadership requires the exercise of an integral process, one in which our mind, our heart, our bodies, and spirits are welcomed in the service of liberation. This integral dynamic generates the conditions for political grace, that force that is born for our communal efforts to transform the world. A critical theory of leadership, then, must encompass pedagogical purpose that rebels against the fragmenting and fracturing of our humanity, and instead aims to prepare and support us to live with a greater sense of love as a political force that can connect us to the truth of our material conditions that surround us and moves us more openly towards relationships of solidarity and social justice. For Freire, the question of ethics is at the forefront of his thinking. This point is made obvious in the book Pedagogy of Freedom, Ethics, Democracy, and Civic Courage. Three particularly significant points in his argument with respect to leadership are: one, the countering of determinism; two, the need to assume responsibility for our lives as both individuals and communal beings; three, that practices carried out only through fellowship and solidarity are important, and an understanding of our unfinishedness, that no matter where we are in our lives, no matter what point we're practicing, the reality is that we are always unfinished. Freire wrote, if the world were created finished, it would no longer be susceptible to transformation. At the heart of this idea of unfinishedness is also the recognition that oppression is never a permanent condition, and it is indeed because no human condition is ever absolute or finished that the struggle remains viable and hope fertile, even within political and material moments that may appear desolate and barren. There is no question that a critical leadership for social justice requires a fundamental shift in how we define our own labor. This demands we shed our internalized oppression, reject colonizing ideologies of domination, establish solidarity with others, recognize ourselves as subjects of history, garner the courage to speak out when necessary, and cultivate a strong sense of social agency in order that we can name, critique, decolonize, and reinvent our world anew in the interest of a more just and democratic future. I have a whole set of indispensable qualities of leadership for social justice that come out of a Freirean perspective, where he talked about the indispensable qualities of teaching. So drawing on Freire's notion of indispensable qualities of struggle, I want to just quickly offer two overlapping sets of indispensable qualities. And this first slide kind of looks at the ethics of political struggle, and the second one looks at ethics of personal struggle. And there has to be an overlap, because in fact, that is what the dialectic is about. So qualities that we would find in the ethics of political struggle would be knowledge of micro and macro systems and their relationship, knowledge of self-contradictions and personal struggles that become organizational contradictions. Recognize the link between culture and power, our ability to read power both formally and impersonally. The being conscious of language use and relationship to power in language. Emphasis on voice, democratic participation, and collaborative decision-making, constantly moving towards dialogue and acting our critical authority in the interest of democratic life. And what that means, and I don't want it to get lost, there is nobody sitting in this room, including myself, who does not have privilege. The question is, how do we use our privilege? Do we use our privilege in the interest of transforming the world? Or do we use our privilege to perpetuate the status quo? Politically, we have to think strategically, to choose our battles wisely, to go beyond our ego. We must look at a commitment to solidarity and community self-determination. Political change must be understood as part of an ongoing process of life. There isn't, it's like sometimes when I hear folks talking about issues of social justice, like they think that somehow we're going to get to an end point, and then the whole world's going to be socially just. There's just no such thing. I mean, that in many ways is a very infantile notion, thinking that somehow we're going to get to where, no, this is an ongoing process. This is a way of life. It's a way of thinking about our life and being in the world that we are trying to move forward. The second set then of indispensable qualities related to critical leadership is around some of our personal questions. So the knowledge of our own personal struggles and limitations. I have to know the people that get on my nerves. I have to know that, and I have to understand what it is about them that does that, because if I don't, what I might in fact do is treat them in demonizing and dehumanizing ways. And at that point, I become the very thing that I say I don't want to do. To have self-vigilance then in one's attitudes and behaviors towards others and the world. To be self-vigilant about our response. What are your expectations of women right now? What are your expectations of a woman of color? What right do you think that a woman of color has to stand up and speak about these issues without apology? Because sometimes we don't think about them. They're so embedded and they're so deep, but they come out in ways in which we don't allow it to come in. We create barriers because on some level we're not sure that person should have a right to speak. We must have a commitment to the common good, and I always go back to the young people when they were struggling in Arizona. Tú eres y otro yo, and I talk about that because it's that sense of you are my other I. I mean, the kind of world we build, if each of you, in my relationships with you, in your relationships with one another, we saw each other as being a part of us, of having a kinship that we must see as being together, that your wellness, your well-being is linked to my well-being. And often we completely miss that piece. Confidence and humility. Comfortable with knowing and also comfortable with not knowing. Having faith and respect for others. Being present and engaged in our communication and our participation. To have courage and be thoughtful when challenging others. To exercise a collective sensibility in decision making. To be what Brady called impatiently patient. To respect the process of change. Commitment to living, working, and loving with integrity. To focus on nurturing relationships rather than just being right. To be grounded in a revolutionary love anchored in justice and in our humanity. Forgiveness for one's own and others' limitations and mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes on this journey. All of us. The issue is, can we bring a sense of compassion to one another? And what are the pieces that allow us not to have compassion? Who do we not have compassion for? Who do we believe we even have a right not to have compassion for in the world? And these are the kinds of questions that I think are important to our neighbor. Compassion for struggles faced in our efforts to become more fully conscious. Each of us here is struggling in our own way. Respect for the preciousness of all life and embracing humor and joy and our sensuality. That means that we bring all ourselves to the table, that this work requires all of us, all of who we are. The struggle for democratic public life then. Giroux has argued, right, that at the very least, academics should be more responsible to and for politics that raises serious questions about how students and educators negotiate the institutional, pedagogical, and social relations shaped by diverse ideologies and dynamics of power, especially as these relations mediate and inform competing visions regarding those interests of the university and what role then knowledge plays in furthering both excellence and equity, and how higher education defines and defends its own role in relation to to its often stated, though hardly operationalized, allegiance to egalitarian and democratic impulses. For radical intellectuals, the university still represents an important terrain of struggle. The university then is this public pedagogical space that we have left in forging of public democratic life. Meaning, when people say, well, why should we care about the university? And sometimes folks will say this, because the university is one of the few public spaces that has left us. And in many instances, it is, in fact, becoming less and less a public space. This is often tied to critical educational efforts, then, that are made by professors who seek to create links between their classrooms and the college campus, the community, the world, in ways that foster and support democracy. Critical leadership approaches, then, are effective in creating emancipatory conditions that support meaningful, critical reflection and dialogue. The development of voice and the collective participation and building of solidarity among administrators, faculty, and students and community. In fact, if there were not for the work of scholars, and many of them scholars of color, many sitting in this room would not have found a place to flourish in this academy, despite legitimate critiques that have been launched and the need to continue pushing the boundaries of legitimacy toward a more humanizing university culture. So critical leadership then, when we think about social justice, supports public democratic life and political dissent. There has to be dissent. And it's not that, there has to be an understanding that within democracy, dissent is one of its major key components. At the point that people are not allowed to dissent, then what we have again is fascism. Political dissent then creates the conditions for administrators and faculty and students to grapple rigorously, not only with theories and practices of democratic life or cognitive phenomenon, but also asks of them to tackle rigorously in the flesh the meaning and consequences of material inequalities and ideologies of racism, Orientalism, Islamophobia, sexism, homophobia, heterosexism, every form. It requires us to be willing to look at how social exclusions are constructed with respect to everyday lives and the larger societal conditions in the world. In the last 3 decades, we have seen neoliberalism steadily negate the hard-earned opportunities gained by the civil rights struggle. Yet what is made clear by this history is that democracy is never guaranteed, which is true today than ever. And as such, we must always keep in mind that democracy is never a given, but rather results in an ongoing emancipatory struggle for political voice and participation within the university, within schools, and the society. As such, higher education exists, for example, as a contested terrain of struggle, given the potential of education to function as a democratizing force. And I think that's one of the brilliance of Freire's work, was that he recognized education as absolutely a political terrain. He recognized that education was a space, a place where democracy could blossom, where democracy could flourish, and that we needed to take that space in relationship to issues of justice. I want to look at just quickly as I end on the notion of a political vision and incomprehensibility. An imagination, fluid and grounded political vision of struggle is particularly necessary today, in that our labor for social change is indeed made more difficult in this historical moment, when neoliberalism has made a farce of the democratic ideal of civic engagement, undermining the public good and the power of our differences. To counter this travesty, we must move in theory and practice beyond reformism and embrace in our daily praxis wider political possibilities which might allow us, in a Deleuzian sense, to bring something incomprehensible into the world. For this is the true stuff from whence genuine social and political transformation is born. I mean, we have to think that part of what we're trying to do is create a world that doesn't yet exist. And to have the courage to see that it does not exist, because we're not yet there. And yet at the same time, to believe the possibility, to believe in the vision of the possibility of a democratic life and a democratic world. This demands from us a more profound sense of our human affiliation, the evolution of consciousness, and a reinstatement in the collective power, a reinvestment in the collective power of social movement and political encounters across our differences. Toward this end, we can strive to become more politically vigilant in our responses to the world, in that we do not fall prey to the common contradictions of either neoliberalism or academic elitism that easily betray our liberatory dreams. This requires that we understand that no one, not one single person, exists outside the system, and that none of us is free of contradictions, and as such, a purity of politics or sectarianism is not the answer either. This speaks to a political vision where uncertainty, ambiguity, discomfort, and incomprehensibility exist in dialectical alliance with their negation. Through the latitude that such political awareness affords us, we can more easily enter into critical engagement with the complexities and nuanced ways in which hegemony impacts our lives as educators and world citizens, as well as the many differences that exist among us as a consequence of our cultural histories and the material conditions of survival. At the heart of such awareness must also be the recognition that liberation, whether in the university, our communities, or in the larger world, can only be enacted through a radically imaginative, hopeful, and loving political vision, where neither diversity nor unity are sacrificed. And I just want to stop there a moment to say to you that it is not unloving to feel anger. It is not unloving to feel frustration. In fact, at times, it is one of the most loving responses that a human being can express is their indignation with the inequality, with the suffering that persists. And there has to be some tolerance. We want to talk about tolerance. There's got to be some tolerance for the human expression of suffering and the consequences of suffering in our work. One of those is the anger and the rage that many of us have to live with day in and day out. Because often it's not seen what it took to, for example, for myself, what it took for me to be standing before you. At 20 years old, I was living in poverty on welfare with 3 children, a single mom. And I learned more, I understood more by what I lived, what I had to struggle with, the knowledge of that often I had professors trying to negate the knowledge that I walked into the classroom with, that came out of my lived history. Most important, even to persist in this long historical struggle for justice requires that we as individuals and collective beings face daily our deeply conditioned fear of freedom and dare to be powerful together. So I end drawing, as I often do in my talks, on Audre Lorde's words. When we dare to be powerful, to use our strength in the service of our emancipatory vision, then it becomes less and less important whether we are afraid. With this in mind, let us remember that the struggle for justice is also a decolonizing struggle for our humanity, which will require us to dare to be powerful together. It will require us to dare to change, to risk change in the interest of democracy. Thank you. All right, so I'm doing what I usually do in class. You know, what I'm doing is I have a structure here, and the structure was to have people break up and look at these questions in their group. There's a set of questions, right, dialogue questions. So the questions are the following: in what ways do you believe that your program is already practicing